A minor arrest led to the shocking discovery of Dominique Pellicot's decade-long campaign of abuse against none other than his own wife. What appeared to be the life of a quiet family man was exposed as a nightmare, as Pellicot drugged and raped his wife Giselle, and he even involved 50 other men in the crime. These men, along with Pellicot, all stood trial in a landmark case that rocked France. And we're going to break down everything we know about this disturbing case. For years, Dominique Pellicot led a quiet life with his wife Giselle and their children. He was a husband, a father, even a grandfather. But beneath the surface, a horrifying story was unfolding. One that would only be revealed after a series of shocking discoveries that turned this family's world upside down. Because as it would turn out, Dominique Pellicot drugged and raped Giselle over nearly a decade, his wife. But it doesn't even end there, because he also brought 50 other men to the couple's home, all of whom participated in raping her, and all of whom stood trial along with Mr. Pellicot last year, facing Giselle Pellicot in that courtroom every day for a massive rape trial that has stunned France and arguably the entire world. Now, as you can imagine, there is a lot to unpack in this story, from the discovery of Pellicot's disgusting behavior to the landmark trial, so we're going to start right at the beginning. According to reporting from the New York Times, Dominique and Giselle Pellicot married in 1973, 2 years after meeting. It was a love story, one that Giselle described as the kind of bond that left them inseparable. And during the trial, she even said, "We were so in love, we didn't want to be apart." They had 3 children. They settled in the suburbs of Paris, where Giselle worked as a manager in a public company. Dominique worked various jobs, including as a real estate agent. And for decades, their life appeared ordinary. But cracks were beginning to form underneath the surface. In 2010, Dominique's darker side began to surface in a very alarming way, because he was arrested for filming up women's skirts in a shopping mall near Paris. Police discovered he had concealed a miniature camera inside of a pen to capture what they termed indecent images. Pellicot ended up being fined €100, but get this, Giselle, his wife, didn't even know this happened. The New York Times reports that she only found out about this 10 years later in 2020. Yeah, it was when he was then facing charges for what happened to her that she finally found out about this. But going back to that, following up on this filming incident, it gets even more disturbing. Because after Pellicot was arrested for that back in 2010, the police collected his DNA. And when they ran it through a database, they uncovered that it matched with blood that was recovered at the scene of an attempted rape going all the way back to 1999. Remember, he was married to Giselle at this time. But here's the thing. According to reporting from The Guardian, the evidence that showed the match wasn't entered into the case file at the time that the crime occurred. Now, it's not entirely clear why that happened, but apparently it did. The case was reopened after Pellicot's arrest in 2020, where he denied involvement at first, but when he was presented with the evidence, he apparently ended up confessing to the crime. He's currently under investigation for that rape case, as well as another case from 1991. This is where a real estate agent was raped and murdered, and authorities say that case bears eerie similarities to the first one. But now let's get back to what happened the following year, 2011. In July 2011, that is when authorities say Dominique Pellicot began drugging Giselle. According to The Guardian, he was crushing sleeping tablets and anti-anxiety medications into her food, which over time led Giselle to experience blackouts. At first, she thought she was just suffering from early signs of Alzheimer's or even a brain tumor. And to make matters even worse, prosecutors said from 2011 to 2020, Pellicot was recruiting men off of a now-defunct website to rape his wife, who was drugged to the point of complete unconsciousness. Now, among the thousands of photos and videos that were uncovered in this investigation, and we'll get into how they were recovered in a minute, but one specific instance that was presented in court was from 2014. It showed 24-year-old Adrian Longeron, one of the men on trial, raping Giselle, who even at this point still had no idea what was going on. It wasn't until a 2020 arrest for yet another upskirting incident that everything was finally exposed. because on September 12th of 2020, Dominique Pellico was caught by a supermarket security guard, again, filming up women's skirts with his smartphone. Because after he's arrested, that is when police seize his phones, a camera, a video recorder, a laptop, a USB key, and an SD card. And what do they find on these electronic devices? Well, on November 2nd, Giselle sits down with police. Now, she's thinking, we're here to talk about my husband's supermarket incident, right? Nope. Instead, the officers showed her the images and the videos from Pellico's electronics and informed her that her own husband had been drugging her for years and inviting dozens of men to sexually assault her. Process that for a second. Imagine being told that. The next day, November 3rd, Giselle, unsurprisingly, moves out of the home that she shared with her now disgraced husband. But this discovery was just the beginning, because now police had to find these other men, and they end up finding them and arresting them using photos, Skype records, phone messages. They tracked down 50 men who had participated in the abuse, and they were arrested beginning on February 9th of 2021. Now, oddly enough, Pellico actually led authorities to a hard drive in his garage where thousands of images and videos were stored in a folder, get this, named Abuse. Yeah. By the way, Pellico was released while awaiting charges, and according to the New York Times, they reported that he actually continued his abusive behavior against his wife for another 2 months. But by November of 2020, time had run out for Mr. Pellico, as the police were ready to expose everything that they had found. So how did authorities uncover literally thousands of incriminating messages? Well, CNN did a deep dive on this, and the details are beyond horrifying. As I mentioned, one of the most chilling aspects about this, apart from, the sheer number of men involved and the cruelty of this abuse, is that Dominique Pellico used the internet to manipulate and recruit others to participate in this abuse of his wife. According to CNN's investigation, all of this was made possible through a website called Coco.fr. So a bit of background on Coco. It was founded back in 2003 by a man named Isaac Steidl, and it was supposed to be a platform for online dating, but it soon morphed into something much darker. The site hosted unmoderated chat rooms where users openly discussed sexual violence, often against women. According to Sophie Antoine, and forgive me if my pronunciation is incorrect, but who works on legal issues and advocacy for the French organization Act Against the Prostitution of Children, signing up for Coco.fr was free. Only required a name, age, postal code, and by the way, even scarier, once you signed off, all of your chats would be immediately erased. And it was here that Dominique Pellico, under a pseudonym, found a community that not only shared his deviant interests, but also actively encouraged them. And just to give you an idea of how bad this website really was, CNN reported that in 2018, a 55-year-old accountant named Michael Solozzi was stabbed to death by a man he met on this website. Now, despite this, Coco continued to run. As late as 2023, the site was receiving over almost 800,000 visits a month. However, the website's downfall came after Pellico's disturbing communications were uncovered. So you go back to 2011, and Pellico began using Coco, the website, to solicit men, again, to rape his wife. And his method of recruiting men was actually disturbingly efficient. He started by initiating conversations in a chat room on the site that was named Without Her Knowledge, and you can only guess what that chat room was being used for. And once initial contact was made with the men in that chat room, Pellico would move the conversations to more private platforms like Skype. In these video calls, he would show his wife, Giselle, unconscious from drugs. He would show this to the men. Sometimes he would even share intimate photos or videos of her, many of which depicted her being raped. According to The Guardian, which posted a full list, by the way, of all of the men that were involved in this, they came from all walks of life, all willing to travel to the Pellico's home in Mazan to carry out the abuse. The youngest was just 27, the oldest 74. Each man took turns abusing Giselle, sometimes multiple times over the course of several years, and Pellico's manipulation of these men was very effective. One text exchange published by CNN in the report showed Pellico saying to one of the men, I'm about to dose her with her sleeping pill. Plan to come tonight at about 3 a.m. With another message from him reading, the longer we wait, the deeper she sinks into sleep. So the breaking point came from Pellico's arrest in 2020, which we mentioned earlier, and that opened this entire can of worms into what was on Pellico's computer and equipment that police confiscated during their seemingly unrelated arrest. And inside those devices were the hundreds of images and videos of Giselle, his wife, being raped, along with thousands of messages exchanged between Pellico and the men that he recruited on Coco. I don't have to tell you, you don't have to be an expert to know this is really bad and really incriminating evidence. And authorities had truly stumbled into one of the most horrific sex abuse cases in modern French history. Now get this, following Pellico's arrest, Coco, the website, continued to operate, unbelievably. In 2022, the founder, Isaac Steidl, moved himself and his company to Bulgaria. He then renounced his French nationality. But Steidl was cooked, because Pellico's case was the catalyst for the closure of that website in June of last year. Now, I will tell you, that is not where this story ends, because according to the New York Times, Steidl was formally indicted this month for a series of criminal charges, some of which are directly tied to the horrific abuse orchestrated by Pellico. Steidl now faces a slew of accusations, including complicity in organized criminal activity, drug trafficking, possession and distribution of child pornography, aggravated pimping, money laundering. If convicted, he's reportedly looking at up to 10 years in prison and a fine of up to 7.5 million euros, which is around $7.7 million in American currency. And after paying a hefty bail of $103,000, Steidl was released from jail, but he's barred from leaving France while this investigation continues. His lawyer, Julian Zanata, proclaims her client's innocence, stating that Steidl firmly denies the accusations and that he will seemingly fully cooperate with authorities to prove his innocence. According to French prosecutor Laurent Bacot, Coco was linked to cases that go way beyond Pellico. The site was linked to over 23,000 criminal cases between 2021 and 2024. The cases involved nearly 500 victims and included a horrifying array of crimes. We're talking sexual abuse, child exploitation, prostitution, drug trafficking, even homicide. So now we go back to the timeline. Dominique Pellico and all 50 men involved stood trial in September of last year, and it quickly became one of the most shocking and widely followed legal cases in recent French history. Because as the details of the abuse were revealed, the courtroom was packed with reporters, victims' rights advocates, ordinary citizens who came to witness this. And even more interesting was that the BBC reported Giselle, the victim in this case, attended this trial almost every single day. And by the way, this is no small choice, because in cases of sexual abuse in this jurisdiction, victims can choose to remain anonymous, to shield themselves from the scrutiny and shame that often is attached to such crimes. But according to the BBC, Giselle waived her anonymity to, in her words, quote, make shame swap sides from the victim to the perpetrator. She was quoted as saying, I want all women who have been raped to say, Madame Pellico did it, I can too. How brave is this individual? Dominique Pellico was facing multiple charges, including a charge of aggravated rape. He actually admitted to drugging Giselle and was quoted as saying, I am a rapist like the others in this room. They knew everything. He also reportedly said, I acknowledge all the facts of the case in their entirety. But during the trial, the New York Times reported that defense lawyers tried to paint Giselle as somebody who enjoyed sex with her husband but was too embarrassed to admit her own sexual desires. The New York Times even quoted a few of the questions she was asked, one of which was, would you not have a secret inclination for exhibitionism? And another question reportedly asked of her was, these photos are very explicit. Not all women would accept this type of photo, even with a loving husband. But Giselle refuted the latter question, as the outlet reported, saying, if a man came to have intercourse with me, he still should have asked for my consent. Now, something else that's pretty bizarre about this trial is that the New York Times reported that Dominique Pellico argued he was the only person who was honest. Yeah, the rapist who admitted to his actions while others tried to hide their involvement. That was a big claim here. But the BBC reported that some of the men said that they were manipulated by Pellico into believing that they were participating in something that was actually consensual with Giselle, who was only pretending to be asleep. and several of the men denied knowing they were being filmed. The reporting says that he described himself as a man who was torn between love for his family and this perverse, overwhelmingly sexual impulse that, after decades of suppression, finally took control. He explained during his testimony, "I did what I wanted when I had the urge. That's the core of this story." He admitted to feeling remorse for his actions, saying how the mornings after he drugged Giselle, the next day was terrible, but I won't complain about it today because that would be indecent. She is the one suffering, not me. Throughout the trial, the BBC reported that mental health experts painted a complex picture of Pellico, a man whose personality seemed to have been divided in two sharply contrasting parts. On one hand, he was the doting husband, the father, the grandfather, but on the other, there was this darker, manipulative side to Dominique Pellico. This was the man who preyed on his wife's unconscious body and who used his charm to lure others into this twisted world. This side of him, it was argued, emerged from a traumatic childhood, which Pellico said was marked by abuse and violence. According to the New York Times, Pellico himself has spoken of witnessing his father sexually assault his mother. He also referred to an alleged sexual abuse that he suffered as a child, although to be clear, no evidence was presented of that in court. But referencing his childhood in his testimony, he said, "In every man there is a demon. Mine came from my childhood." As the trial continued, Giselle's children, David, Caroline, Florian, they also testified, according to the New York Times. For them, the revelations were nothing short of catastrophic. They had grown up believing that their family was stable, loving, just ordinary. But the truth shattered that illusion and forced them to confront the dark reality of their father and their father's actions. David, the eldest son, spoke tearfully about the shock of discovering what his father had done, saying, "I don't know who my father is anymore. The man I grew up with, he's not the man I thought he was." David also expressed concerns that his own children might have been victims of their grandfather's abuse. Caroline, too, shared her own painful story. In addition to witnessing the abuse of her mother, Caroline has gone on record saying she believes that she, too, had been drugged and assaulted by her own father. Though she says he had repressed these memories for years, the evidence uncovered during the investigation brought everything back to the surface. Investigators did uncover photos of Caroline in compromising situations, which she believes were taken after he drugged her. But Pellico denied ever sexually abusing Caroline and offered no explanation for the photos. But here is what's really awful. When Antoine Camus, the lawyer who was representing Giselle and the couple's children, asked him to liberate his children from this nightmare that they had experienced, his response was arguably very brutal, because he said nothing but, "That's their problem, not mine." Now, in the last few days of this trial, Pellico's defense lawyer concluded her remarks by reading two poems that Pellico had written in prison, in which he expressed remorse and asked his family to remember the better version of him. But the evidence against Dominique Pellico was undeniable. And after 4 months of testimony, the court finally delivered its verdict in December, where Dominique Pellico was sentenced to 20 years in prison after being convicted of aggravated rape and other charges. 20 years in prison is the maximum penalty for aggravated rape in France. All 50 of the other men, too, that were involved in this abuse, they were also convicted. And you had sentences that ranged from 3 to 20 years. However, I will say the trial's outcome was not without controversy, because some of the sentences were lighter than those sought by prosecutors, and this sparked public outrage. According to The Telegraph, Giselle's family, particularly her children, felt that the sentences didn't truly reflect the horror of what had happened. And here's just a glimpse of the sentences that a few of these men received, as reported by the New York Times. So you have Jean-Pierre Maréchal, who pleaded guilty not to raping Giselle, but to following Dominique's blueprint in drugging and raping his own wife. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison, though the prosecutor had recommended 17 years. Carly Arbo, a 22-year-old laborer, received a 13-year sentence. But get this, Arbo had visited the Pellico home 6 times. That was far more than most of the other men. Joseph Coco, a retired manager from a beer company, was convicted of a lesser charge of aggravated sexual assault. He was sentenced to just 4 years in prison. Coco was one of the few defendants who expressed remorse, even asked Giselle for forgiveness during the trial. The longest sentence after Pellico's was 15 years. That was given to a man who who visited the Pellico home 6 times, engaged in unprotected sex despite knowing he was HIV positive. Despite the disappointment over the leniency of some of these sentences, Giselle's just absolute courage in speaking out, attending this trial, the attention this trial garnered, this has created a lasting impact on France's understanding of sexual violence and consent. And now that brings us to where we are today. Because following the sentencing, Pellico's daughter, Caroline, wrote a book. It's entitled, I'll Never Call Him Dad Again. And this is where she delves deeply into the issue of chemical submission and its impact, because she explains how in many cases the abuser is somebody the victim knows and trusts. Quote, the danger comes from inside the home, she says, and she stressed how ordinary substances and medicines are weaponized in these crimes. But here's the thing, unfortunately, despite these convictions, this is far from over. Why? Because 17 of the 50 men who were convicted in this case, they have appealed their sentences, according to a statement from the prosecutor's office. The New York Times reports that a new trial is expected to begin in the final months of 2025. It's supposed to be heard in southern France. Again, thinking about this all happening again, Giselle maybe having to testify again, this evidence being presented again, I know everybody's entitled to their legal rights, but that just reinforces the pain and the trauma of all this. In this case, it's our understanding is going to be heard by a panel of 3 judges, a 9-person jury with a decision reached by a majority vote. Beatrice Zavarro, this is Pellico's lawyer, explained that her client had decided not to appeal the ruling, reasoning that such a move would subject Giselle to further emotional distress. But remember, Dominique Pellico is still under investigation in connection with the rape cases from 1991 and 1999, and it is possible he will face further charges for those alleged crimes. That's all we have for you right now.